Around a year ago, I released my most popular video, a look at why the Mongols are so often known as Tatars in historical sources, and their relation to both 12th century and modern Tatars. The general argument was that the name of the Tatar tribe of Eastern Mongolia, destroyed by Temujin in 1202, was confused by Chinese, Islamic, and Europeans as the name of the Mongols. After the fall of the Golden Horde, the descendants of the Mongols mixed with local Turkic populations, adopted the name and still today call themselves Tatars. Overall, in that video I emphasized the distinction between Mongol and Tatar. Since then, there have been developments. For one thing, the use of Tatar is far more widespread than I knew. Not only European, Russian, Arabic, Persian, and Chinese sources, but Korean, Armenian, Georgian, Vietnamese, and Indonesian materials all use Tatar just as, or more often, than Mongol, even when recording letters or quotes from the great Khans. When almost every single people the Mongol Empire interacted with called them Tatars, we have to wonder how they could all have confused them with an exterminated steppe tribe. Yet, some sources do insist upon the usage of Mongol, perhaps none more significant than their very own secret history of the Mongols. How do we corroborate these two seemingly inconsistent trends? An intriguing solution to this issue has been proposed by historian Stephen Pow. Essentially, that the Mongols before Chinggis Khan called themselves, as a general term for their people, Tatars, with Mongol being a designation for their empire founded in 1206, which is how the relationship is depicted in missionary and envoy accounts from the early 13th century. Then, around the 1240s, the great Khans began urging the use of Mongol over Tatar, especially after 1250. This is apparent in official histories compiled by the imperial government, where Tatar was eventually restricted to the tribe destroyed in 1202. Obviously, this interpretation doesn't fit well with the secret history of the Mongols, where Chinggis Khan is only ever called a Mongol. Yet, even this ties into Pow's argument, and for that, we need to discuss sources. First is the matter of official and unofficial sources. Official sources were written on the orders of the Mongol imperial family, or compiled from imperial documents for an official state-sponsored history. These also happen to be the most commonly utilized sources and have strongly influenced views of the empire. Although written in Mongolian, Chinese, and Persian decades apart, their depictions align closely, all having used the secret history and the same now lost Mongolian sources. Here, Mongol is almost always used over Tatar, and in the secret history, Tatar is only used for the Eastern Mongolian group. Part of Pow's argument is that these official sources were written after 1250, a period which, especially under Kublai Khan, saw the creation of official histories to justify the ascension of the Toluids and reflect the interests of these later Khans, and don't necessarily reflect how Tatar was used earlier in the century. In comparison, we have unofficial sources, works written outside the empire or not on imperial order, such as the reports of envoys and missionaries to the Mongols. These writers record statements which are difficult to align with the old theory, such as quotes from Mongols identifying themselves as Tatars. They also have the name of the Mongol Empire being taken from the earlier Hamag-Mongol Union. One of the earliest is Li Xinchuan, a Jin dynasty official who in 1216 reported that the Tatar ruler, Chinggis Khan, had adopted the name Mongol and declared the Great Mongol State, with Jin frontier officials calling them Mongol Tatars. Song envoys to the General Mukhalai in 1220 recorded this description. The Tatars admire the Mongol as a heroic state. Therefore, they've called their dynastic name the Great Mongol State. I personally witnessed that their acting emperor, Mukhali, Prince of State, every time he referred to himself he said, "I am a Tatar." All of these great ministers and field marshals call themselves saying, "We are Tatars," and they do not know what type of name is this Mongol that they use. Neither the name they use for their kingdom, nor the name of the year. That earlier Mongol state is often called the Hamag Mongol Confederation, a poorly known entity of the early 12th century destroyed by the Jin dynasty in the 1150s. We do know Chinggis Khan went to some effort to connect himself to this earlier union, for reasons of legitimacy. In the secret history of the Mongols, Chinggis Khan is shown as a descendant of the Hamag Mongol Khans, and the invasion of the Jin Empire as avenging earlier Jin atrocities towards the Hamag Mongol. Chinggis Khan may have borrowed the name of this state to confer greater legitimacy upon his own, demonstrating that he was not some upstart bandit, but the rightful ruler of the Mongols. Song embassies to Ergadai's court in the 1230s likewise record the rulers were Tatars of the great Mongol state. On the subject of Ergadai, we have his own words recorded in a letter to the Koreans in late 1231. If you want to do battle, you should know that in the great nation of the Han, we Tatars have gathered all of the nations surrounding us in the four directions. The letter's English translator, G. Ledyard, noted this letter is in very poor Chinese, reading like a very direct, hurried translation of Mongolian into Chinese by someone not totally fluent in the latter, suggesting first an oral translation into Chinese from dictated Mongol before being written down and sent to the Koreans. Certainly not the work of educated scholar officials, and suggests the Koreans did little to tamper with it. If they had, they may have tried to fix the grammar. But it is in line with the quality of Chinese often found in letters associated with the Mongols. It's likely that this letter is a good approximation of Ergadai's words, and it's doubtful that a translator would have snuck Tatar in there if Ergadai hadn't used it himself while dictating the letter. These are far from the only examples, but are amongst the most intriguing. Across Asia, the earliest materials from interaction with the Mongols follows this pattern, using Tatar heavily, and when Mongol does appear, it is usually in reference to the state itself. Early Western works, such as those of Ibn al-Athir, Friar Julian, and al-Nazavi, all call them Tatars. An Armenian Gospel from 1236 calls them Black Tatars, matching the Chinese classification of the Tatars as white, black, or wild Tatars. In this system, Chinggis Khan was a black Tatar. Queen Rusudan of Georgia, in a 1223 letter to the Pope, described how her kingdom had been ravaged by the Tatars, while the Rus, on their defeat at the Kalka River that same year, called the invaders Tatars. The Rus seemingly got the name from the Kipchak, who, since the early 1210s, had had dealings with refugees fleeing Chinggis's unification of Mongolia, so they likely learned the name right from the source. In these early sources, Tatar was the most common means to refer to the Mongols. The few times Mongol is mentioned in these sources, it is usually the name of the state. These were written across the breadth of Asia, not making this confusion based off one single author's misunderstanding. How could so many writers be confusing the Mongols with a tribe no longer extant? Were the Mongols too polite to correct everyone calling them the wrong name? It seems likely that Tatar was not a name forced on them by others, but something of a general term used by the nomads of Mongolia. Around 1240, we start to see a shift, though why is unclear. Essentially, Mongol starts to replace Tatar as the preferred ethnonym. This is seen in the reports of European missionaries and diplomats to the Mongols in the 1240s and 50s. Travelers to the Great Khans found that they were actually averse to the use of Tatar. The Franciscan friar John di Plano Carpini uses the awkward phrase, "the Mongols whom we call Tatars," repeated several times throughout. A similar phrase is in the Dominican Simon of St. Quintin's work, an envoy sent to the General Baiju in 1247. They indicate the Mongol leaders were specifically calling themselves Mongol rather than Tatar, a distinction never emphasized in earlier works. William of Rupruck traveled the empire in the 1250s. visiting the courts of Batu, his son Sartak, and Mönch. In his account, Sartak's officials instructed him not to call Sartak a Tatar, and after describing Chinggis Khan's unification of Mongolia, wherein he indicates the Mongols and Tatars as separate tribes, he provides this statement. But now, on account of their frequent wars, the Tatars have almost all been wiped out, and so the Mongols wish to abolish the Tatars' name and bring their own to the fore. Past about 1250, we frequently find Mongol instead of Tatar, or even Mongol Tatars. Not only is this the period when the aforementioned official sources were beginning to be produced, but we now have sources by writers born after the initial Mongol invasions. In the late 1250s, we have two major Persian writers, Juvayni, a high official in the Mongol administration, and Juzjani, a refugee who fled the Mongols to seek refuge in the Delhi Sultanate, and was famous for his hatred of them. Both writers overwhelmingly use Mongol instead of Tatar, which makes only a few appearances. Interestingly, Juvayni always uses it for the Mongol peoples as a whole, never for a specific tribe. We do not see a total disappearance of Tatar, but its use often seems to be as an insult. An obvious example is in Europe, where the very word was mutated into a reflection of the Greek hell, Tartarus, suggesting the Mongols came from hell. Juvayni at one point calls them Tatar devils. When the Yuan dynasty invaded Vietnam in the 1280s, they were angered to find that the forces of Dai Viet had killed the Tatars tattooed on their bodies, which led the Mongols to kill everyone they found with such tattoos. The Chinese certainly had rude characters to refer to the Mongols, essentially meaning stinky Tatars, but these aren't so common until the Ming dynasty. So what do we make of all this? Did the Mongols change their name because their subjects were being rude to them? That's unlikely. Subjects angry at Mongol rule would find a way to turn whatever name the Mongols used into a slur. More significant, Pow suggests, was a matter of timing and legitimacy. Time-wise, the shift could have occurred with the final defeat of their longtime enemy, the Jurchen Jin dynasty, in 1234. The destruction of their ancestral foe may have brought on a new sense of legitimacy and identity as a state. By then, an entire generation had grown since the founding of the empire, with an increasing sense it was heaven's will for them to rule the world, a shared destiny. Basically, they were adopting the state's name, Mongol, as a name for the people who had emerged since 1206. And once we get to the 1250s, when the Tuluides began writing official histories to justify their usurpation of power, Mongol was retroactively forced back, as if it had always been used, with Tatar increasingly restricted to just select tribes. The fact that these are our most commonly used sources for the period, and that Mongol became the name of the homeland and the people still living there, reinforced this division. Another possible influence is that a variety of sources from the time of Ergadai Kublai refer to water Tatars in eastern Mongolia being rebellious and armies being needed to suppress them. It might be then that as Mongol was coming to be seen as referring to the people of the empire, that the older term came to be used for those unwilling to accept the Khan's rule. Of course, that is speculation. It is hardly uncommon for dynasties to fudge their histories for a preferred narrative. Genealogies and naming are even easier to edit when there is no pre-existing literature to combat. And who is there to challenge your claim when you are heaven's appointed rulers of Eurasia? Tatar, as a word, does predate the Mongol Empire by centuries, showing up as early as the Orhan inscriptions of the 700s. In contrast, the appearances of Mongol before 1200 are speculative, and based on reconstructions which could indicate other peoples. For the Tatars of Western Russia, their use of the name was not an adoption of a European term, but a continuation. The official histories described earlier originated in Persia and China, quite outside the Golden Horde. A prisoner of Batu in 1241, Rogerius, never uses the name Mongol, while in 1245 Batu told a Rus prince to drink Erig as he was already one of them, a Tatar. The children of Juche were outside of Mongolia since the time of the Khwarezmian campaign, rarely returning. Sartak, a son of Batu, did spend time in Karakoram, and not coincidentally, he is the only one specifically designated as a Mongol in the sources. Outside of the internal dealings of the imperial court and the later affairs of the Toluids and their need to rewrite history, perhaps Mongol never had a chance to replace Tatar within the Kipchak Khanate, Tatar becoming too well established as local tribes were forced to adopt it. So there we have Pow's argument and evidence. Tatar was the original endonym of the tribes north of China over the 12th century, with Mongol perhaps the name of a minor clan associated with the Borjigin and the brief Hamag Mongol. Not much more than a military alliance, the Hamag Mongol had neither the power nor the will to change the name of the tribes, yet their leadership remained a source of legitimacy on the steppe, and when Temujin united the tribes in 1206, he presented himself as a continuation of his ancestors' state, only declaring that his new state was the Great Mongol Empire, Mongol being the state, while Tatars were the people. Over time, as its leadership grew up within the Mongol Empire and found themselves answering heaven's call for domination, they began identifying themselves by the name of that state, and Mongol slowly and imperfectly replaced Tatar, at least in the imperial court and Mongol homeland. The official histories written after this therefore over-exaggerate the presence of Mongol in the early part of the century. Meanwhile, they were still Tatars to the people they encountered, and continuing to use Tatar instead of Mongol was a small form of defiance against Chinggisid pretensions. The branches of the family outside of the imperial court, or often ostracized from it, such as the House of Juche, never really adopted it and continued to use Tatar, as their descendants such as the Tatars of Crimea and the Volga still do today. Pow's argument is hot off the press, so there hasn't been much time for a response to it, but it does offer an explanation to a problem which has long plagued scholars, and similar ideas have been proposed before, though not as radical or thorough. Does this mean that this channel and everyone interested in the topic should replace the use of Mongol with Tatar? Well, no. For one thing, that would complicate standard practice. Further, if Mongol was the word associated with the state founded in 1206 and eventually adopted, then it is perfectly fine to remark that they were Mongols, and it was a Mongol empire, thus demonstrating the all-compassing effects of Chinggis Khan's transformation of Mongolia and his creation of the Mongols.